Sup guys, today I'm going to attempt to find a single weakness of Z52. Let's start with the basics, her damage and survivability. I'm going to be relying on calcs done by other players for this part, so I will link my sources in the description. Looking at the calcs done by Rei Kurozuki, he has her placed at even with Plymouth against light armor, and then handily beating Plymouth against medium and heavy armor. Personally, I don't put too much weight in calcs apart from carriers. I can vouch that his carrier calcs, aside from Fritz Rume, make reasonable assumptions and line up closely with my own carrier calcs. I'm a bit skeptical on whether or not Rume's guns will have enough accuracy for her to outperform Nakimov though. Vanguards are a lot more tricky to calculate because guns, torpedoes, and barrages typically have unpredictable hit rates that vary depending on the enemy. For example, experience tells me that Hindenburg deals more damage on average compared to Unzen against light and medium armor, contrary to what the calc says, so I would rather just raise the ships and test them in game in various different environments. However, Plymouth is pretty much the poster girl for consistency when it comes to Vanguard damage right after the DDGs, with most of her damage coming from her main gun and aimed barrages. And Z52 is no different, with all of her damage being targeted from her barrages. As a result, calcs are more reliable than usual as a starting point for comparing these two. Additionally, his calc assumes the single 113mm is being used, and I'm confident that he knows the real cooldown of the 113mm is 0.6 seconds with absolute cooldown taken into account, so it should be quite accurate. Notice that her damage spread is also balanced across all three armor types, contrary to some of the other ships like Plymouth and Hindenburg, who are generally not the best options against heavy, and Unzen against light. With a damage spread like this, which is above Plymouth and not far from the likes of Unzen and Hindenburg, it's hard to say that damage output will be a weakness of hers. Next is her survivability. EHP is a function of a ship's defensive stats. Things can get a little weird and heavily deviate from calculations when invincibility, conditional skills, and timed skills come into play, but Z52 has none of those, instead relying on solid stats, a flat damage reduction, and predictable heals. Looking at the detailed EHP document maintained by Mebot, his calcs place Z52 with a single 113mm at 126% of Portland's EHP, which is within the realm of Bayard, Prinz Eugen, Felix Schultz, Azuma, and so on. This means that she should be able to quite comfortably main tank all of campaign and a lot of meta bosses, although she might have some trouble with Arbiter Hard mode with no external help whatsoever. Among destroyers though, she is only second to Laffy 2. I'm ignoring Eldritch because her skill is one of those things I mentioned earlier that makes calculations very tricky, though that is not to say Laffy's skills don't make her calcs weird as well. Also, since these calcs are for a single battle, and she has healing in her kit, unlike Laffy and Felix, she will gain more EHP the more battles you do, making her potentially even tankier than Laffy in campaign. In any case, I don't think that her bulk will be of any issue. Okay, so both her damage and survivability is among the best. But that's not enough. In Chapter 15, having poor anti-air could be a detriment to the fleet, leading to the main fleet's death. That's not an issue either, as Z52 has more anti-air than the likes of Scylla with her abnormally strong ghost anti-air gun. While it's not the absolute best like San Diego, Laffy 2, Shimanto, and Guam, she has a 25% flagship damage reduction skill, which helps to offset her lower anti-air. This is especially good when paired with Musashi, the best flagship for Chapter 15, who absorbs all incoming plane damage. And what about her anti-submarine capabilities? She has the 4th highest anti-submarine stat among all destroyers at the moment. There are ships like Eldritch Retrofit and Hammond 2 with skills that increase their anti-submarine capabilities a lot more, but even then, Z52's anti-submarine capabilities are above that of Laffy 2's, which is reliable enough for Chapter 15. Okay, now what about damage contribution? Could it be the case that she would end up having less damage contribution than some other ships, since she's lacking in team buffs? For instance, Could Plymouth contribute more damage to the fleet with her 18% damage debuff for the flagship? The answer is, once again, no. She has a universal damage debuff, which is tied to the top main fleet ship's attacks. 5% may not seem like a lot, but then you realize Plymouth is only buffing one battleship or aviation battleship, but Z52 is buffing everyone in the fleet, including carriers and vanguards. In fleet compositions where the flagship is dealing a third or less of the entire backline's total damage, for example when using Soyuz with carriers, this debuff is a massive upgrade over Plymouth. Needless to say, the biggest difference is when you're not using any battleships, which is often the case for myself. Also, in the Kearsarge Yorktown fleet, Kearsarge is typically sortied as the flagship for Plymouth's buff. However, if you do choose to replace Plymouth with Z52, you can place Kearsarge in the top position instead, resulting in a lot of extra uptime on Z52's debuff thanks to her desynced fighter airstrike and main gun salvos. Don't forget, it is obviously good to run Plymouth and Z52 together if you can afford it to, but if you're going to choose between the two, then Z52 would be the superior option in most cases in terms of personal damage, total damage contribution, and survivability. So what's the catch? Does she have any RNG skills? No. I often complain about RNG skills when they show up, so I just want to thank the devs for the complete absence of RNG skills this time around. Does she have annoying faction, or class, or equipment restrictions? None. Is she lacking in synergy? No. She can receive many powerful buffs from commonly used ships, like Firepower from Bismarck Zwei, Firepower Evasion and Anti-Submarine from Shinano, and if you really want to meme, you could even buff her damage, survivability, and anti-air significantly with Z1. Does she require the enemy to be burned? Nope. Does she require multiple pieces of plus 13 rainbow equipment like Hindenburg, making her not beginner friendly? Just a plus 10 gold gun is enough, and if you can't get that, then a blue gun is barely a downgrade. She doesn't need Oxytorps either, since most of her damage scales off firepower. Okay. Since she's a firepower-based ship, maybe she runs into trouble against shields. No. Her Barrage completely ignores shields, so she's even more better than the competition against shielded enemies with the exception of Hindenburg. Okay, what about her design? Nothing really to complain about on that front either. Really, the only way I can see her failing is if somehow the DPS calculations are severely off, or for some reason future fights require you to run a vanguard of Napoli, Laffy 2, and Eldritch Retrofit just to survive, neither of which sound very likely. After trying as hard as possible, I could not find a single weakness in Z52's kit. I think Z52 is almost certainly the new best vanguard ship in the game, and I will be placing her in the top spot of my vanguard tier list. Plymouth will fall to third place since Eldritch's role is completely different, and Plymouth's old spot is now typically going to be occupied by Z52. I do have one complaint though. Why couldn't it be Janus?